The soldier hit the floor before the gurney did. Arterial blood painted the trauma bay in wide arcs, the kind of spray that meant seconds, not minutes. Monitors flatlined before anyone could read them. The lead surgeon took one look and started backing up. 3 other doctors froze where they stood. The room smelled like copper and burning rubber and something darker underneath. Nobody moved. Nobody knew what to do with a wound pattern like that. Ragged, deep internal damage that defied the textbooks on the wall. Then a quiet voice cut through the noise. Not the surgeon, not the attending. The nurse in the corner, the one nobody ever looked at twice. She said 3 words, and then she pushed everyone out of the way and saved his life. Before we go any further, this is your first time here, hit that follow button right now because this story is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. Like this video, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. The rain had been falling on Draylen, Oregon for 6 straight days. Not the soft Pacific Northwest mist that tourists photographed and put on postcards. This was the kind of rain that found its way through sealed windows, that pooled in the elevator shafts of older buildings, that made the walk from the parking structure to the Harwick General Hospital entrance feel like crossing a river. The automatic doors at the ER entrance had been sticking for 2 weeks. Maintenance had been notified 3 times. The doors still stuck. Nora Voss noticed things like that. She noticed them because nobody else did, and because in an emergency, a real one, not the controlled theatrical chaos that ER departments perform for administrators during quarterly reviews, a stuck door was the difference between a patient bleeding out in a vestibule and a patient making it to a bay in time. She had put in 3 separate work orders. She had mentioned it verbally to the charge nurse supervisor, a broad-shouldered man named Dale Ostrander, who had looked at her the way he always looked at her, with the particular kind of patience people reserve for minor inconveniences they plan to ignore. "I'll flag it again," he'd said, which meant he wouldn't. Nora was 29 years old and had worked the Harwick General Emergency Department for 3 years. In that time, she had become, by the assessment of most of the senior medical staff, a perfectly adequate nurse. Not exceptional, not the kind you noticed in a crisis. She was quiet, she did her charting on time, she didn't argue with the attendings, and she had the face of someone who had decided, some years ago, not to let anything show. The doctors who rotated through the ER had different relationships with different nurses. They joked with some, deferred to a few, ignored most. And with Nora Voss, they did something that was harder to quantify. They looked past her. Not unkindly, just completely. Dr. Preston Gall was the worst of them, which was saying something because he was also the best trauma surgeon in Harwick County. He was 44, loud in the way confident men were loud. Not rudely, exactly, just always slightly louder than necessary. And he had the institutional authority of a man who had been the most important person in every room he'd walked into for the last 15 years. He remembered the names of the nurses he liked. He forgot the names of the ones he didn't need. He had never once used Nora's name. On the morning of the storm's 7th day, she was 40 minutes into a double shift when the radio chatter started. She caught it at the station, not because it was loud, but because she was already paying attention to the frequency. The Harwick General Trauma Pager had been quiet since 2 in the morning, and quiet stretches in a Level 2 trauma center. This close to the coast highway made experienced ER staff nervous. Silence in an ER was the sound of something building. The call came through at 6:47 a.m. MVA on Route 9 with complications. Law enforcement on scene. Inbound ETA 6 minutes. The dispatcher's voice had that particular flatness that meant she was working to keep it flat. The controlled professional tone that concealed something ugly underneath. Nora was already moving before the overhead announcement finished, already running through bay assignments in her head, already calculating which attending was on and what equipment was currently staged. She didn't know yet what was on that incoming ambulance. Nobody did, not exactly. What arrived 6 minutes later changed the weather inside the hospital. The paramedics came through fast, one of them already on the radio calling ahead, the other physically running alongside the gurney and talking without stopping. The information coming out in clipped fragments that Nora assembled in real time as they moved. Male, approximate 30s, blunt force thoracic trauma, possible tension, pneumothorax developing, BP crashing, GCS dropping on approach, and then the part that made Dr. Gall, who had come in from the adjacent bay, go very still for half a second. Multiple gunshot entry wounds, at least 3, patterned in a way that didn't match a random shooting. The patient was big. Not Jim big, the other kind, the kind that came from doing something physical for a long time in a serious way. Even unconscious and gray-faced and bleeding through 2 layers of field dressings, there was something about him that registered differently. Nora clocked it in about 3 seconds. The calluses on his hands, the scar geometry on his forearms, the specific type, the way the wounds were grouped. She'd seen groupings like that in different contexts, a long time ago, in a different life. She didn't say anything about any of that, not yet. Bay 3, Gall said, already pulling gloves on, and the team moved. The next 90 seconds were the controlled version of chaos, everyone moving with purpose, everyone knowing their function, the choreography of emergency medicine that looked frantic from the outside, but had its own internal logic. Nora worked the left side of the bay, managing the IV access, running the secondary assessment while the attending ran primary, calling numbers as she found them. His pressure was bad. His oxygen saturation was heading somewhere nobody wanted it to go. Then the monitor spiked and dropped and spiked again in a pattern that stopped Nora's hands. She'd seen that pattern before. Not on a simulation, not in a textbook. In an actual human being, in actual conditions, where the difference between reading the pattern correctly and reading it wrong was whether that person kept breathing. "There's a third bleed," she said. Nobody reacted. Gall was focused on the chest film that had just come up on the portable. "Dr. Gall." Her voice was level, not loud. "There's a third point of hemorrhage. It's not on the film. It's..." "Nurse." Gall didn't look up. "I need you to manage the IV lines and stay out of the diagnostic, please." The monitor did the thing again. Nora watched the waveform for exactly 2 seconds. "Move," she said. "I've got him." She said it the way you said something when you weren't asking. There was a beat, the kind of beat where a room recalibrates. Gall looked up, then, actually looked at her, and what he saw on her face apparently gave him enough pause that he didn't immediately respond. Nora was already moving around the foot of the gurney, already reaching for the ultrasound probe, her hands doing something efficient and purposeful that was at complete odds with the way she'd existed in this department for 3 years. "What do you think you're—" "Subxiphoid window," she said, not to him specifically, to anyone who was listening. The probe touched the patient's chest, and she read what it showed her in about 4 seconds. Pericardial effusion? Significant. He's about 90 seconds from tamponade, and your film won't show it. The respiratory therapist made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Gall stepped forward and looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long moment. His jaw worked. "Get cardiothoracic on the phone," he said to the tech behind him. "Now." "There isn't time for that," Nora said. "You do not perform a pericardiocentesis in my trauma bay. Tell me how long he has, and I'll wait." The monitor answered that question before Gall could. The patient's pressure collapsed to a number that made the respiratory therapist swear under his breath, and in the frozen half-second that followed, Gall made a decision that senior surgeons sometimes made and rarely admitted to afterward. He stepped back. Nora had the needle positioned before anyone finished processing that he'd moved. Her hands were steady in a way that hands weren't supposed to be steady in a situation like this. Not from training, not from adrenaline management, not from years of practice in a controlled environment. Steady the way. Hands were steady when they'd done worse things in worse conditions, and the person attached to them had made a decision somewhere along the way to simply not let the body respond to fear anymore. She found the angle, felt the resistance change, and drew back. The monitor pattern shifted. The patient's pressure began to recover. The room was very quiet for a moment. "Someone want to get cardiothoracic down here," Nora said, still focused on what she was doing. "So we can get this properly managed?" Nobody said anything for another few seconds. Then a nurse named Doreen, who had been in the department for 11 years and had seen a lot of things, said quietly, "I'll call them. Check." The federal agents arrived 17 minutes later. Nora didn't see them come in. She was finishing the handoff documentation, running on the particular kind of adrenaline that didn't feel like adrenaline. The flat, focused energy that she'd spent 3 years trying to keep banked and controlled and invisible. She was aware that something had happened in the trauma bay that she would need to think about carefully. She was also aware that she'd had no choice. The patient would have died. Whatever the consequences were for her, they were secondary to that. She was at the nursing station when Dale Ostrander appeared at her elbow. He was doing something unusual. He was looking at her directly. "There are 2 men asking to speak with you," he said. "They're in the family consultation room. I'm in the middle of... They're federal." He kept his voice low. "They have credentials. One of them asked specifically for the nurse who performed the intervention in Bay 3. Nora set down her tablet with a deliberate motion. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes," she said. She took 4. The family consultation room at Harwick General was designed to be nondescript and unoffensive. Beige walls, a table with rounded corners, chairs that were marginally more comfortable than waiting room furniture. The kind of room where doctors told families things that couldn't be untold. Nora had been in this room before, from the other side of the table. But the 2 men who stood when she entered weren't carrying the particular weight of bad news. They were carrying something else. The taller of the 2 had the build and the haircut and the quality of stillness that Nora associated with federal law enforcement. Not the performative intensity that TV got wrong, but the actual thing, which was more like a very precise kind of patience. His name, he said, was Special Agent Damon Reyes. He was FBI. He showed her his credentials, and she looked at them the way she always looked at credentials, which was carefully. The second man was younger, with a tablet computer and the focused expression of someone whose job was to observe and record. He didn't introduce himself. "Ms. Voss," Reyes said, "thank you for speaking with us. You didn't give me a lot of options. The man you treated this morning, we need to confirm a few things. First, how is he?" "Stable, last I heard. Cardiothoracic has him." She sat down across from them without being invited to. "You want to tell me why federal agents are in my hospital at 7 in the morning asking about my patient?" "In a moment. Can you tell us what you observed about his injuries? You can get that from the chart. I'd like to hear it from you." Nora looked at him. He looked back at her without blinking. She thought about how many ways this conversation could go, and then chose the one that seemed most straightforward. GSW, multiple. Entry pattern wasn't random. Wound characteristics were consistent with a close-range engagement, not a drive-by, not an accident. His physical presentation was consistent with someone who'd been in extended field conditions before the injury, not just someone who got shot. Reyes's expression didn't change. "What do you mean by field conditions?" "I mean his baseline physical state. Hydration levels, old scar tissue, the specific wear pattern on his hands." She paused. "I mean, he looked like someone who'd been somewhere difficult doing something difficult for a while before whoever shot him did it." "And you assessed all of that in a trauma situation." "I was managing his care. I assessed what was relevant." Reyes leaned back slightly. He traded a look with the younger man that Nora wasn't supposed to catch, and did catch, because she caught things like that. "Ms. Voss," he said, "your intervention was recorded on the trauma bay cameras. The footage has already been reviewed." "I figured it would be." "The procedure you performed, pericardiocentesis under emergency conditions without attending authorization, is outside the scope of registered nursing practice in the state of Oregon." "The patient was dying. I understand that, but the issue isn't just the procedure." He opened a folder on the table between them. It was a thin folder. "The way you performed it, the speed, the technique, the diagnostic read from the ultrasound, these aren't skills that appear in your employment record." Nora said nothing. "You've been at Harwick General for 3 years," Reyes continued. "Before that, your record shows a nursing position at a clinic in Portland for 18 months. Before that, travel nursing in the Midwest. Your references check out. Mostly." He paused. "It took us about 40 minutes to find the gaps." The room was very quiet. "What gaps?" Nora said. "The 2 years between the travel nursing positions. There's no employment record, no tax filings, no residential address, no digital footprint of any kind." He looked at her steadily. "People don't disappear for 2 years without a reason, Ms. Voss." I took time off. People who take time off don't perform emergency cardiac procedures with the technique you just demonstrated. He slid a photograph across the table. Do you recognize this? She looked at it. It was a military document. A commendation record, partially redacted, with a photograph attached to the upper right corner. The photograph showed a group of people in field gear, faces partially obscured by the redaction, but not completely. Not enough. Nora kept her face very still. That's classified, she said. Where did you get that? And the moment she said it, she understood that she had just told him everything he needed to know. Reyes didn't smile. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had just confirmed something he'd suspected but hadn't been certain of. The patient you saved this morning, he said quietly, is a special operations soldier. He was transporting recovered intelligence when he was attacked. The people who attacked him are still in the area. Nora set both hands flat on the table. And you're telling me this because the intelligence he was carrying is still missing, and because whoever's looking for it knows this hospital is where he ended up. Reyes leaned forward slightly. And because I think you know more about what we're dealing with than you've told us. The fluorescent light above them buzzed once, faintly. I'm a nurse, Nora said. I need to get back to my patients. The hospital is being locked down as we speak. Nobody in or out until we clear the situation. He paused. I'm not arresting you, Ms. Voss. I'm not accusing you of anything. But I need you to understand what's happening here, because I think you already do. She looked at the photograph again, at the shapes of the people in it, at the landscape in the background that nobody who hadn't been there would recognize. Give me the room for a minute, she said. I'm sorry? Tell your colleague to step outside. She looked at the younger man. I'll talk to you. Just you. The younger agent looked at Reyes. Reyes held Nora's gaze for a moment, then nodded once. The younger man gathered his tablet and left without a word, pulling the door shut behind him. Nora waited until the footsteps moved away down the hall. How did you find that photograph? She asked. Joint Task Force database. It was flagged 2 hours ago when we ran your biometrics from the Trauma Bay footage. Which means it was already in the system. Yes. Which means someone had already looked for it recently, before today. Reyes's posture changed very slightly. What makes you say that? Because if it had just been sitting there unremarked for years, a nurse performing an emergency procedure in Oregon wouldn't have triggered a flag. Something else had already moved that file. She looked at him directly. What happened before this morning, Agent Reyes? What happened that made someone go looking? He was quiet for a moment. 3 weeks ago, he said slowly, a secure military communications channel was breached. The breach exposed the identities of several personnel involved in a classified overseas operation that was officially listed as unsuccessful. Multiple casualties, mission aborted, team dissolved. He paused. The personnel records associated with that operation showed that several of the individuals involved had died in the field. Nora's hands were still flat on the table. Showed, she said. Some of those records may have been inaccurate. The fluorescent light buzzed again. I need you to understand, Nora said carefully, that if what you're suggesting is true, if someone who is listed as deceased in a classified record is currently working as a nurse in a level 2 trauma center, that arrangement existed for reasons, security reasons, reasons that were not arbitrary. I understand that. Do you understand that if the breach you're describing exposed those records, then whoever breached them now knows about those arrangements and knows where to look? Something shifted in Reyes's expression. Not surprise. He was too trained for that, but a recalibration. That's why the soldier was attacked, he said. Not a question. I'm telling you nothing. Nora stood up. I'm going back to check on my patients, but if you actually want to keep this hospital secure, I'd suggest you stop focusing on the nurse and start asking yourself why that intelligence was being transported by road instead of through a secure channel. She picked up the photograph and looked at it one more time. And I'd suggest you consider the possibility that whoever attacked your soldier already knows the layout of this building. She set the photograph down and walked to the door. Ms. Voss. She stopped but didn't turn around. The name on that classified record, Reyes said. It isn't Nora Voss. She put her hand on the door handle. I know, she said, and walked out. The lockdown announcement went out at 8:12 a.m., phrased in the careful administrative language that hospitals use to avoid panic. A security review, a precautionary protocol, staff please remain in designated areas, visitors please proceed to the main lobby. Nora moved through the corridors with her badge visible and her pace unhurried, the way she always moved, which was the way someone moved when they'd learned that the fastest way to not be noticed was to look like you belonged exactly where you were. She needed 3 things. First, to verify that the patient in cardiothoracic was properly protected, not just medically, but physically. If Reyes was right about the intelligence, about what the soldier had been carrying and what it was worth, then the men who'd attacked him might make another attempt. A hospital with a lockdown in progress was chaotic enough to provide cover. Second, to find out what she could about the breach Reyes had mentioned. If the classified records had been accessed, it wasn't random. Someone had gone looking for something specific, and the list of people who knew what to look for was very short. Third, she needed to think clearly about what came next because Reyes had just made her position substantially more complicated than it had been 90 minutes ago when she'd simply been a nurse performing a procedure she technically shouldn't know how to perform. She stopped at the cardiothoracic ICU on the 4th floor and checked in at the nursing station. Casually, professionally, the way she'd done 100 times when following up on a transfer. The charge nurse there, a composed woman named Petra, confirmed that the patient had made it through the initial stabilization and was being prepped for surgery. "Any issues with the security sweep?" Nora asked. Petra frowned slightly. "What sweep?" "The lockdown protocol. I assumed they'd post someone outside his room. There's one of your federal friends down the hall, but he's just standing there." Petra glanced in that direction. "Nobody said anything about a sweep." "One agent. For a patient carrying recovered military intelligence in a building currently under lockdown due to a security concern related to that patient." Nora thought about that for a moment. "Thanks, Petra." She moved away from the desk. She went down the main corridor toward the elevator bank, then stopped. The elevator to her left showed a car on its way up. Not unusual, except that the time was 8:19 in the morning, and the hospital had been in lockdown for 7 minutes, which meant non-emergency movement in and out of the patient floors should have been close to 0. She watched the number above the door climb. 3. 4. She stepped back into the alcove next to the supply room. The elevator opened. 2 people came out. They were wearing Harwick General Maintenance uniforms, the gray coveralls with the facility management logo on the breast pocket. One of them was carrying a tool bag. The other had his hands in his pockets. Nora had worked in this building for 3 years. She knew the maintenance staff the way she knew the layout of the supply carts, and the blind spots in the corridor camera coverage, and which stairwell doors stuck. She did not know either of these men. They moved down the corridor with the confident pace of people who knew exactly where they were going, which was the direction of the cardiothoracic ICU, which was the direction of the single federal agent standing outside a room containing a critically injured soldier and whatever information existed in his memory or on his person about a piece of stolen military intelligence. Nora stood in the alcove and did something she rarely let herself do anymore. She ran through the options very fast. She could call Reyes. She had no way to reach him without going back to the consultation room, and that was 3 minutes she didn't have. She could call security, but hospital security in a lockdown situation was managing 5 different priorities and would take time to respond. She could follow the 2 men. She could get between them and the room before they reached the agent. Or she could be wrong. They could be actual maintenance staff responding to an actual call, and she could be a nurse with a compromised cover identity and an excess of tactical paranoia reading threat patterns into 2 men carrying tools. She was not wrong. She knew she was not wrong, the same way she'd known about the pericardial effusion, not through certainty, but through pattern recognition built from experience that didn't belong on her nursing license. She stepped out of the alcove and went after them. "Hey," she said, loud enough that it carried. "Maintenance, hold on." They stopped and turned. They looked at her with the specific kind of blankness that wasn't actually blankness. It was control, the very deliberate neutrality of men who'd been trained to present a face that gave nothing away. "I need to see your work order," Nora said. She pulled out her tablet and made the gesture of checking something on it, which was a thing nurses with tablets did constantly, which was why she did it. We've got a protocol issue on this floor. Everything needs to be logged through the charge nurse before... We've got authorization from facilities, the one with the tool bag said. His accent was flat, mid-Atlantic, precise. Great. Then you've got a work order number. Give it to me and I'll clear you in about 30 seconds. He reached into his pocket. Not for a phone. Nora was already moving when his hand came back out, because she'd known he would. Because the moment she'd said the words, work, order number, she'd seen his eyes go to a specific point over her left shoulder, which was where the corridor camera was, and the way he'd assessed it told her everything she needed to know about why he was here. What followed was not clean. It was not dramatic. It was about 11 seconds of controlled violence in a hospital corridor on the 4th floor of Harwick General Medical Center. And at the end of those 11 seconds, both men were on the floor, and Nora Voss was standing over them with her tablet in one hand and the tool bag in the other, breathing carefully through her nose. The tool bag did not contain tools. She was looking at what it did contain when she heard running footsteps from the direction of the stairwell. Not the men, they were down. And then the fire door burst open and 3 people came through it, and Nora had about a half second to process the fact that the lead one was Damon Reyes, and that he was looking at her with an expression that had traveled somewhere well past professional composure into something more fundamentally human. He looked at her. He looked at the 2 men on the floor. He looked at the tool bag. He said, "How did you—" "Elevator timing," she said, "and their boots. Their boots." They were wearing facility maintenance uniforms, but maintenance staff on this floor wear steel toes because of the equipment storage on sublevel 2. These are tactical, low profile, but tactical. She set the tool bag down carefully. "You've got a security gap on room 412. 1 agent for a high-value patient in a compromised facility." Reyes was already on his radio. One of the agents behind him moved past her toward room 412. She let him go. "You want to tell me," Reyes said, looking at her, "what you just did?" "I stopped 2 people who were not maintenance workers from reaching your patient." "That's not what I mean." She understood what he meant. She picked up her tablet. "I need to get back to the ER. My patient's Nora." She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her name, not Ms. Voss. Her name. And something in the way he said it, not aggressive, not demanding, just direct, made her stay where she was for a moment. "The record that was flagged this morning," he said. "The name on it. I looked it up after you left the room." He paused. "The operation it references. I know what it was. I know what it was supposed to accomplish, and I know how it ended." She didn't respond. "The report says the medic assigned to that unit was killed in a communications blackout during the extraction phase. It says her body was never recovered." He held her gaze. "I've read the debrief. I've read what happened to the rest of that team." The corridor was very quiet now. His 2 agents were occupied. The 2 men on the floor were not going anywhere. "Whoever set that blackout up," Reyes said, "whoever made sure that extraction failed, they weren't just trying to kill a mission. They were eliminating witnesses to something bigger." He took a step toward her. "And the breach 3 weeks ago that exposed those records? It wasn't a hack. It was an inside pull. Someone with credentials reached into that database and started running names. The ventilation system hummed above them." "Someone was looking for survivors," Nora said. "Yes." She looked down at the 2 men on the floor, at their tactical boots and their false uniforms, and the things in the tool bag that were not tools. "Then this wasn't just about the intelligence the soldier was carrying," she said. "No. They came here for something specific." She said it slowly, working through it. "They came here because of the flag, because the biometric flag on the trauma bay footage triggered something in the database, and someone watching that database saw your face," Reyes said, "and sent these 2 to confirm it." The fluorescent light at the end of the corridor flickered once. Nora Voss, whose real name was on a classified document in a federal database marked as deceased, whose skills belonged to a world she had walked away from with extraordinary care and considerable personal cost, looked at Damon Reyes and understood that the 3 years she had spent being invisible in this hospital had just ended. Not because she had failed to be careful, not because she'd made a mistake, because she had saved a life, because the monitors had screamed and nobody else had known what to do, and she had done what she'd always done, which was exactly what the situation required. And now something she'd buried was clawing its way back to the surface, and there were two unconscious men in tactical boots on the floor of the fourth-floor corridor, and somewhere in a cardiothoracic ICU. A soldier who didn't know her name owed her his life, and the person who had destroyed everything she'd once been part of was apparently still operating, still watching, and had just found out she was alive. "I need a phone," she said. "Who are you calling?" She looked at him steadily. "Someone who needs to know that the people who betrayed us haven't finished." Reyes handed her his personal cell without asking what number she needed, which told her he'd already made a decision about how much he trusted her, and she wasn't sure that was wise on his part, but she took the phone anyway. She walked to the far end of the corridor while his agent zip-tied the two men on the floor and called for backup transport. The rain hammered the window at the end of the hall. She stood with her back to the room and dialed a number she had not dialed in 3 years. A number she had memorized and never written down and had spent a long time hoping she would never need. It rang 4 times. She counted. Then a voice she recognized said, "This line isn't active." "It is now," Nora said. "Calloway." "It's me." A pause. Longer than the previous 3 years warranted. Longer than a simple recognition pause. The kind of pause that meant the person on the other end was running calculations. "I'm going to need you to say something else," the voice said. "Something only you would know." "Sector 9. The supply drop that never came. You ate my last protein bar and didn't admit it for 6 days." Another pause. Then, "Christ." "I need about 30 seconds of your attention," Nora said. "Then I need you to make a call I can't make from here." "Where are you?" "Oregon. The flag is real. Someone ran the database 3 weeks ago, and this morning they sent confirmation." She kept her voice low and even. "2 men. Tactical gear under facility maintenance cover. They're in custody, but whoever sent them will know in the next few hours that the confirmation failed." "Are you—" "I'm fine. The issue isn't me. There's a special operations asset in the ICU here who was carrying recovered intelligence when he was hit. The intelligence is still missing, and the network that ran the breach, I think it's the same people, Calloway. I think it's Mercer's people." The name landed on the line like something physical. She could hear him breathing. "That's not possible," he said. Mercer's operation was dismantled. The Harlow Review confirmed what someone wanted it to confirm. You know that. I know that. We both knew it when we read the summary 3 weeks before She stopped. "Before everything. Nora. Don't." She pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose. "I don't need the conversation. I need you to contact whoever you still have at JSOC and tell them the Mercer network is operational. Tell them it's not dormant, it's not dismantled, it's active, and it just tried to confirm the survival of a witness." She paused. "Tell them the witness is still alive and currently standing in a hospital corridor in Draylen, Oregon, which means they have about 8 hours before the situation requires a different kind of response." "I can't just—" "You can. You're the only one left who can." She let that land. "The rest of us are dead, remember?" He was quiet for a moment. "Give me 2 hours," he said. "You have 90 minutes." She turned back toward Reyes, who was watching her from down the hall with the careful expression of a man listening to a conversation he couldn't hear and trying to read it from body language. "And Calloway, if you still have access to the communications logs from the Harlow Review, not the summary, the raw logs, pull anything tagged with the Draylen routing code. I think there's something in there that didn't make it into the final report." "What are you looking for?" "I don't know yet. But someone went into that database 3 weeks ago with credentials, which means they had inside access, which means the breach wasn't external. It was internal," he said. "Yes." She hung up and walked back to Reyes. He took the phone without asking who she'd called. That was either professional restraint or a deliberate choice to preserve plausible deniability, and she wasn't sure which yet. "We need to move your patient," she said. "The surgical team is—" "I know where the surgical team is. I'm telling you that this building is no longer secure and that the 2 people currently in zip ties are going to be the first and last warning we get." She looked at him steadily. "Whoever sent them will have a protocol for non-confirmation. They'll wait some number of hours, not many, And when they don't hear back, they won't send 2 people the next time. Reyes looked at the men on the floor. He looked at Nora. The hospital administrator is already on the phone with the field office, he said. Then get your field office to authorize a transfer to a secure medical facility. You have assets that can handle that. I have 4 agents in this building. Then make more calls. She turned toward the stairwell. I'm going back to my patients. When your office decides to handle this appropriately, you know where to find me. Nora. He said it with the same directness as before, not demanding, just certain. You're not going back to the ER. She stopped walking. Because you're in the middle of something, he said, and we both know it. She stood with her back to him for a moment. The stairwell door was 12 feet away. The ER was 4 floors down, and it was full of patients who needed actual nursing care. And it was also a place where she had spent 3 years being invisible and ordinary and overlooked. And that was over now, regardless of which direction she walked. She turned back around. What do you need? She said. They set up in the 4th floor conference room, a different one from the family consultation room, larger, with a whiteboard and a projector that took 3 minutes to connect, and then displayed Reyes's laptop feed in a washed-out blue that made everything look colder than it already was. His backup agents arrived within 20 minutes, 2 more from the Draylen Field satellite office, a communications specialist named Pharaoh, who carried more equipment than anyone else and said almost nothing, and a woman named Adayeze Mbeki, who was introduced simply as a federal liaison, and who looked at Nora's employee badge with the particular attention of someone cross-referencing it against something she'd already read. Nora noted that. She noted Mbeki. The 2 men from the corridor had been transferred to a federal holding location with minimal paperwork, which meant someone high enough up the chain had made a call quickly, which meant Reyes had more institutional weight behind him than his 4-agent setup had suggested. She sat at the conference table and listened to the briefing without interrupting, building her picture of the situation from the gaps between what they said and what they left out. The soldier's name was Garrett Wills. He was 37, special operations, and had been running an off-book recovery operation in the Pacific Northwest for the past 6 weeks. Off-book meaning sanctioned at a level above standard unit command, which meant someone in the chain of command had authorized it, and that someone was not, apparently, coordinating with the FBI field office in Oregon. The recovered intelligence he'd been carrying consisted of a physical drive, old format, encrypted, containing records from an operation that had officially concluded 4 years ago. The operation had a name. Reyes said it flatly and then watched Nora's face. She kept her face still. You recognize that name? Mbeki said from across the table. Not a question. I've heard it, Nora said carefully. You were part of it, Mbeki said. Still the same flat, informational tone, like she was reading from a file, which she probably was. The room adjusted. Reyes looked at Nora. The communications specialist, Pharaoh, did not look up from his equipment. The operation experienced a catastrophic failure approximately 4 years ago, Mbeki continued. Team extraction was compromised by a communications blackout that, according to subsequent review, was attributed to equipment failure in the field. She paused. 3 team members confirmed deceased, 2 listed as missing, 1, the unit's senior combat medic, confirmed deceased based on eyewitness account from the sole surviving officer. The sole surviving officer, Nora said, a Major Terrence Gaston. He submitted the after-action report. He was the basis for the casualty list. The name Gaston was not new to her. The version she knew involved a dark 2 hours in a communications blackout in conditions she had spent 3 years trying not to dream about, and a decision she had made in those hours that had been the right decision and the only decision, and still cost her everything she'd had. Gaston's report said I was dead, she said. Yes. Gaston's report was wrong. Or, Mbeki said, and there was something careful in the way she said it, something that meant she'd been thinking about this for longer than this morning. Gaston's report said exactly what Gaston wanted it to say. The projector hummed. Rain came harder against the single window. You're telling me he fabricated the casualty report, Nora said. I'm telling you that the database breach 3 weeks ago originated from a terminal at a federal contractor facility in Virginia, and that facility's security logs show Major Terrence Gaston, currently retired from active service and employed as a defense intelligence contractor. badged into the building at 11:47 p.m. on the night of the breach. Mbeki turned her tablet to face Nora across the table, and then spent 4 hours running names through a classified personnel archive. Nora looked at the tablet, at the security log, at Gaston's badge photo, unchanged from the version she carried in her memory of that night, except that he'd gotten older and she hadn't known until this moment that he'd survived. Her hands were on the table. She was aware of them. She kept them still. He was looking for survivors, she said. He found one. And then he sent those 2 men. That's the working assumption, yes. Mbeki set the tablet down. The question is why? What's on the drive Garrett Wills was carrying that's worth sending a confirmation team to a hospital in Draylen, Oregon? You don't have the drive, Nora said. No, the drive was not on Wills when he arrived. Either he secured it before he was shot, or they took it during the attack and he made it out without it, Nora said. Which means they already have what they came for, and the confirmation team was exactly what I said. Confirmation. They came to verify that the flag was accurate, that the medic from the operation was actually alive. Reyes had been quiet for the past few minutes. He spoke now. Why does it matter if you're alive? Nora looked at him. Because I was there, she said. At the end, when the blackout happened, the last 2 hours before extraction, I was the only one who was. What happened in those 2 hours? She was quiet for a moment. The rain, the projector hum. I saw something, she said. I saw a communication that wasn't supposed to exist. A contact between someone inside our operational command and someone external, private sector, well-funded, not affiliated with any sanctioned intelligence body. She paused. It was brief. I caught it by accident on the backup channel when everything else went dark. I didn't understand all of it at the time. I understood enough. Enough for what? Reyes asked. Enough to know that the blackout wasn't equipment failure, and enough to know that when Gaston filed a report saying I was dead, he did it because he needed me to be. She looked at the whiteboard, at the names and dates and connection points that Pharaoh had begun filling in without being asked. Because I'm the only witness to a communication that proves the operation wasn't just compromised by bad luck. It was sold. The extraction blackout was deliberate. The people who were supposed to bring us out knew we were there and chose not to come. The room was very still. Someone sold the extraction, Reyes said. Someone sold everything, Nora said. The mission, the team, the intelligence we'd collected, and then made sure the after-action record said it was a field accident with no surviving witnesses. She exhaled. They were almost right. Mbeki had stopped taking notes. She was looking at Nora with an expression that had moved past professional assessment into something closer to genuine weight. The drive that Wills was carrying, she said slowly, if it contains records from that operation, communications logs, transaction records, anything that corroborates what you witnessed, then it's not just an intelligence recovery, Nora said. It's evidence, and whoever currently has it knows that. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Pharaoh, who had not spoken since his introduction, said without looking up from his equipment, I've got a signal. Everyone looked at him. The drive, he said, still not looking up, still running whatever he was running, has a passive locator embedded. Older format. It's not broadcasting actively, but it responds to a specific ping. He looked up then. Someone at JSOC thought ahead. The drive was designed to be found if it was taken. Where? Reyes asked. Maritime District, southwest of the city. He turned the screen toward the table. It's stationary, has been for about 90 minutes. Nora looked at the location on the screen. She knew the Maritime District. She knew what was down there. Industrial, port adjacent, the kind of infrastructure that had fewer cameras and more places to move things without being observed. She had driven that route on the coast highway more times than she could count in the past 3 years. In the mornings when she needed to think, and the Oregon coast was the only landscape that felt honest enough. She thought about the communication she'd seen 4 years ago in a communications blackout at the worst moment of her adult life. She thought about Gaston's badge photo on a security log at 11:47 p.m. She thought about 2 men in tactical boots lying zip-tied on a hospital floor. She thought about Garrett Wills in a cardiothoracic ICU, alive because she'd been paying attention when everyone else had panicked. "That location," she said. "How many exits?" Reyes looked at her. "You're not going there." "I didn't ask if I was going there. I asked how many exits." "Nora, I know that part of the waterfront," she said. "I know which structures are occupied, which ones are access points, and which ones have lines of sight to the highway approach. That information is either useful to you or it isn't." She looked at him directly. "Is it useful?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the screen. Then at Mbeki, who gave him nothing either way. "The main pier structure has 2 vehicle exits," Pharaoh said, reading from whatever geographic data he had open. "1 coastal road approach, 1 internal service road. Service road connects to the freight depot 3 kilometers north. There's also a water exit," Nora said, "small craft dock on the southeast face of the main structure. You can't see it from the road approach, and it doesn't show on most maps because it was decommissioned commercially about 12 years ago, but the infrastructure is still there and it's still functional." She looked at the screen. "If they're in that location, and they have the drive and they know we pinged it, that dock is how they leave." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "How do you know that?" he asked. "I run in the mornings," she said. It wasn't a complete answer, and they both knew it. He accepted it anyway. "I need to call this in," he said. "Full tactical response. This doesn't move without authorization." "Make your calls," Nora said. "I'll be here." He stood up and moved to the far corner of the room with his phone. Mbeki began writing something. Pharaoh went back to his equipment, monitoring the signal, watching the dot on the screen that had not moved. Nora sat at the conference table and looked at the whiteboard. At Gaston's name, written in Pharaoh's careful print. At the operation name she had spent 3 years trying to not think about. At the date of the communications breach, 22 days ago, and the date of this morning, and the distance between them that suddenly felt very short. She thought about what Calloway had said, "Give me 2 hours." And she thought about the 90-minute window she'd given him and the fact that 40 minutes of that had already burned. She thought about what a JSOC response to an active intelligence recovery situation looked like, and how long it took to arrive, and whether it would arrive in time to matter. The signal on Pharaoh's screen pulsed once, then it moved. "Reyes," Pharaoh said, and his voice had changed, flat and fast. "Target is mobile." Reyes turned from the corner. "Direction?" "South, toward the coast access road." Pharaoh looked up. "They're heading for the water." The dock. The decommissioned dock that didn't show on most maps. Reyes looked at Nora. She was already standing. "How long to the Maritime District?" she asked. 12 minutes in current conditions." "You have tactical units?" "2 vehicles. They're positioned at the hospital perimeter." "Call them off the perimeter," she said. "The threat to this building is neutralized. The threat to the intelligence is mobile, and it has a destination and a timeline." She looked at him. "Make the call, Agent Reyes." He hesitated for exactly 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than she'd expected, and 1 second shorter than she'd feared. Then he got on his radio. Nora picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She was still in scrubs. She was still wearing her Harwick General badge. She had no weapon, no tactical equipment, and no official standing in anything that was about to happen. She also had the precise knowledge of what was on that drive, why it mattered, and what the people running for that dock would do to keep it from being recovered. That knowledge was the most dangerous thing in the room, and it lived in her memory, and nobody was taking it anywhere. She followed Reyes out of the conference room and down the hall toward the elevator, and behind them, Pharaoh's voice tracked the moving signal in a steady, measured cadence, and the dot on his screen moved south through the rain-soaked streets of Draylen toward a dock that the city had forgotten existed. On the floor below, in the cardiothoracic ICU, Garrett Wills lay sedated and monitored, breathing on his own now, the crisis in his chest that Nora had addressed that morning giving way to the slower work of repair. He did not know her name. He did not know that the nurse who had kept him alive was currently pulling on her jacket in an elevator heading toward the ground floor. He did not know that the thing he'd been carrying, the thing he'd taken a gunshot to protect, was 23 minutes ahead of them on a route to a dock no one was supposed to know about. He did not know any of that. But in the elevator, Nora looked at the badge on her scrubs, the photo, her name, the department. She thought about who had issued it and what it had cost her to build and whether she would have it by the end of the day. The elevator doors opened onto the ground floor lobby, and through the rain-streaked glass of the entrance, she could see the two tactical vehicles Reyes had called in, their lights off, engines running, waiting, and beyond them, through the gray downpour, the road south. She walked through the doors. The rain came sideways off the coast by the time they reached the Maritime District, and the two tactical vehicles moved without lights through the service road that ran parallel to the waterfront, their tires cutting through standing water that had nowhere left to drain. Nora was in the second vehicle with Reyes and two agents whose names she hadn't caught, and she was watching the GPS track on Pharaoh's remote feed through a tablet one of them had handed her without comment, watching the dot that represented the drive sit stationary again at the edge of the pier structure. Stationary meant they hadn't reached the dock yet. Stationary also meant they knew the ping had happened and they were waiting for something. A boat, a contact, a window in the weather. None of those options were good, but stationary was better than moving, and 12 minutes of rain-blind driving had cost them enough ground already. Dock access is on the southeast face, she said. You can't approach from the service road without being visible from the upper level of the pier structure. There's a crane platform about 40 meters east of the dock entrance. It's elevated, good sightline over the approach. You're telling me they'll have a position on the crane, Reyes said. I'm telling you that if I were moving something valuable to a water exit and I had people to spare, I'd put one of them up there. He relayed this to the lead vehicle through his radio, clipped and fast. The response came back in tactical shorthand she could partially parse. 2 agents were going to cut around the north end of the structure on foot. 2 more would hold the road approach. That left Reyes and the pair in her vehicle uncommitted, which meant they were the contingency, which meant Reyes had correctly identified that the situation had variables he hadn't fully mapped yet. How many people are we looking at? She asked. Unknown. The 2 from the hospital were local assets. Hired confirmation, not core network. What's at that dock could be anything from 2 to 8. If Gaston's running this personally, he'll have no more than 4. He was always minimalist. Redundancy made him nervous. She said it and then stopped, because she hadn't planned to say it, because it was the kind of thing that came out when you'd spent enough time running operations with someone to know their habits, and she hadn't spoken Gaston's name in 4 years, and the familiarity in her own voice made her feel something she didn't want to feel in a moving vehicle 12 minutes from a confrontation. Reyes looked at her. He didn't comment. The vehicle stopped at the north end of the service road, behind a rusted equipment shelter that blocked the sightline from the pier. Rain hammered the roof. The agent in the passenger seat was already checking his weapon. You stay in the vehicle, Reyes said to her. She said nothing. That was not the same as agreeing. She stayed in the vehicle for 4 minutes. She counted them. She could hear the radio traffic, clipped, professional. The 2-man team moving around the north perimeter, the road team holding position, Reyes checking in with the lead vehicle. What she couldn't hear was the dock. What she couldn't see was the southeast face of the structure, which was the only part of this that actually mattered. At 4 minutes and 12 seconds, 2 things happened simultaneously. The radio erupted with a burst of overlapping transmissions, and the tablet in her lap showed the signal dot moving again us, fast, directly south, toward the water. She was out of the vehicle before the door fully opened. The rain hit her immediately. Cold, hard, soaking through the scrubs in the first 5 seconds. She moved along the wall of the equipment shelter and then cut right, toward the pier structure's east face, because the north perimeter was the obvious approach, and obvious approaches in a situation like this were where people got shot at. She heard the gunfire before she cleared the corner. 2 shots, then a pause, then a sustained exchange. Pistol calibers from the north, the FBI team. Heavier return fire from somewhere elevated, which confirmed the crane platform, which confirmed she'd been right, which did her no practical good right now. The east face of the pier was a corrugated metal wall with service access hatches at intervals. She'd seen them on her morning runs, never thought she'd need to know where they opened. The second hatch was unlocked. She pulled it open and went through into the interior of the structure. Inside was large and dark and smelled like salt water and rust and diesel. The main floor was an old freight staging area, concrete, empty except for stacked pallets along the far wall, and a rusted overhead crane track that ran the length of the building. Light came from emergency strips along the ceiling, dim and yellow, casting everything in a color that made distance hard to judge. She could see the dock opening at the far end of the building, a wide rectangular gap in the south wall where the structure opened onto the water. And through that gap, bobbing against the dock, a rigid hull inflatable boat, engine idling, 2 people near the boat, one of them holding the drive. She could tell by the way he was holding it, careful, both hands, not the way you held equipment, but the way you held something that mattered. The other one was watching the north approach, weapon up, tracking the radio noise. She had no weapon. She had a concrete floor, a pile of pallets, and the overhead crane track. She ran the geometry in her head. The crane controls were at the base of the tower on the east wall, maybe 30 meters from where she was standing. The crane hook itself was suspended over the middle of the staging area. The boat was directly below the crane's southern travel limit. It wasn't a plan. It was a problem with one solution, and the solution was stupid and relied on 3 things going right in sequence. And she knew from experience that sequences almost never went right completely. She moved toward the crane controls anyway. She was 15 meters from the control panel when the man watching the north approach turned and saw her. He didn't shout. He raised his weapon. "Down," she said, the way she'd learned to say things that needed to happen immediately and without negotiation. And she dropped behind the pallet stack as the first shot hit the metal above her head with a sound like a steel rod striking a bell. The echo bounced around the structure. She pressed flat against the concrete and ran the timeline. The man with the weapon was going to close the distance or hold position. If he held, she couldn't reach the controls. If he closed, she had a window. She listened to his footsteps on the concrete, listened to the pattern, and when she heard them quicken, closing, not holding, she moved. Not toward the controls, toward him. The second shot went wide because she wasn't where he expected her to be, and by the time he recalibrated, she was close enough that the weapon was no longer the relevant factor. She put him down in 4 seconds using the concrete floor as leverage, and it was not clean, and she took an elbow across the jaw that made her vision white for a moment. And when it cleared, she was breathing through her mouth and tasting something metallic, and her hands were shaking slightly in the way hands shook when they'd done something physical with a great deal of urgency. She got up, picked up his weapon because she needed it, and because leaving it on the ground near a conscious person was not something she was going to do. He was conscious. He'd stay that way. She moved to the crane controls. The panel was older than she'd hoped. Manual toggle, no electronic lock, but the motor startup sequence took 12 seconds she didn't have. She hit the power switch and heard the crane's motor engage somewhere above her with a grinding reluctance that announced itself across the entire building. The man by the boat heard it. He looked up. And then Reyes came through the north access door with 2 agents behind him, which meant the firefight outside had resolved, which meant she had maybe 5 seconds before the situation at the dock became a standoff instead of an interception, before the man with the drive made the calculation that the boat was faster than the outcome of a standoff and went for the water. She tracked the crane hook's position. It was moving, responding to the toggle, swinging on its cable with the slow deliberateness of machinery that had been dormant too long. "Shoot the crane lock," she shouted. Reyes looked at her across the length of the building, 50 meters of bad light and rain noise and a crane motor grinding overhead. "The cable lock on the secondary mount," she said. "East side of the track. If you break it, the counterweight drops and the hook swings south." She looked at him directly. "He's going for the boat." The man by the dock had heard all of this. He was already moving. Reyes raised his weapon. He looked at the crane track. He looked at Nora. He fired. The shot hit the secondary mount housing, and the cable lock gave way with a sound like a snapping guitar string magnified 40 times. The counterweight dropped. The crane hook swung south on its cable in a long, accelerating arc. Not a small movement, not a gentle swing. The full travel of a heavy industrial hook at the end of 30 meters of steel cable, moving fast enough that the air moved with it. It hit the dock entrance support column at the southwest corner. The column held. The dock planking didn't. The outer section of the dock sheared away from the structure and dropped into the water, taking the boat's mooring line with it, and the rigid hull inflatable lurched sideways as the line went taut and then snapped, and the engine, still idling, drove the boat in a sudden arc away from the dock and into the open water of the bay. The man with the drive was on the dock when the planking went. He wasn't on the dock afterward. He hit the water at the edge of the intact section, and the drive hit the concrete of the remaining dock and skidded to a stop 6 inches from the water's edge. Reyes's agents were already moving toward the dock. Nora was still at the crane controls. Her jaw hurt where the elbow had connected. Her hands had stopped shaking. The man she'd put down on the concrete behind her was saying something she didn't listen to. The crane motor was still running, the hook swinging in a slower arc now, the counterweight having done what physics required it to do. She turned off the motor. The building got quieter. Not quiet. The rain was still hitting the roof, and there was shouting from the dock as Reyes's agents pulled the man out of the water, and somewhere above the structure the crane track was settling with a series of metallic complaints. But quieter, Reyes crossed the floor toward her. He was wet. He had an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not relief exactly, and not the professional composure he'd maintained through the morning. Something between the two that didn't have a clean name. "The drive?" she asked. "Secured." He looked at her jaw. "You need to have that looked at. I'm a nurse." "That's not what I meant." She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "How many?" "2 in custody from the dock, 1 from the crane platform. He came down when the shooting stopped. The man outside the boat." He paused. "4 total, including yours on the floor." 4. She'd said no more than 4. Gaston ran minimal. "Gaston?" she asked. "Not among them." She'd known somewhere before she asked, because Gaston wouldn't have been here. Gaston was the kind of man who sent people and managed outcomes from a distance, who constructed systems so that his hands were never on anything that could be traced, who had survived 4 years with a compromised operation record because he was good at exactly that. He'd sent 4 people to a dock in Draylen or Oregon. He was somewhere else entirely. "He'll know by now," she said, "that the operation failed." "Yes. And he'll move. Whatever else he has in place, any remaining leverage, any remaining evidence that the drive would expose, he'll move to contain it." She looked toward the dock where one of the agents was carefully bagging the recovered drive in a manner that made her think he'd handled evidence in conditions like this before. "What's the ETA on Calloway's contact?" Reyes frowned slightly. "The call you made this morning." He said 90 minutes. It's been... Her sentence ended because her phone, not hers, Reyes's, which she'd used and then returned and which he'd apparently had in his jacket through the entire operation, began vibrating in his pocket. He pulled it out, looked at the screen. His expression shifted. He handed it to her without a word. She looked at the number. Not Calloway's number. A different one, with a routing prefix she recognized from a very specific institutional context. Not FBI, not DOJ, not any civilian federal designation she could have explained to Reyes without a longer conversation than they had time for. She answered it. The voice on the other end was not Calloway. It was a woman, precise and unhurried, who said, "We have a problem beyond the drive. Gaston's name is on a secondary contract. One the Harlow Review never flagged because it was buried under 3 layers of contractor shell companies. The contract is still active." Nora's hand tightened on the phone. "What's the contract?" "It authorizes a supplemental operation in the event that primary evidence recovery fails." A pause. "The supplemental target is not the drive." "Then what is it?" "It's the witness," the woman said, "and the contract specifies that it needs to be completed within 4 hours of a primary failure." Nora looked at the time on Reyes's phone screen. The primary operation at the dock had just ended. She didn't need to do the math. "Garrett Wills," she said. "No," the woman said. "Not Wills. He's a courier. He doesn't know what he was carrying. The contract specifies the witness who can testify to the original communication." A pause that lasted exactly 1 second. "It specifies you." The rain on the roof of the pier structure was very loud for a moment. "How did they get a current location?" Nora asked. "The same way they got everything else this morning. The biometric flag went to more than one terminal when it triggered. Reyes's office got one alert." Another pause. "Someone else got another." Nora lowered the phone, looked at Reyes. He was reading her face. "We need to move," she said. "Where?" She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Not about whether to say it, but about what it meant that she was about to. about the difference between the woman who had walked into Harwick General 3 years ago with a fabricated employment record and a deliberate plan to disappear, and the woman standing in a rusted pier structure with someone else's blood on her jacket and a recovered intelligence drive 30 feet away. "Back to the hospital," she said. "Why?" "Because whoever received that second alert is already calculating that I'll run. Running is what I've been doing for 4 years, and it's what the contract assumes I'll do." She handed the phone back to him. "I'm not running." Reyes looked at her for a moment. "And at the hospital?" "At the hospital," she said. "There's something they don't know about, something I put in place 3 years ago when I took that job, because I wasn't stupid enough to think this day would never come." She started walking toward the north access door. "And I need to get there before they do." Reyes fell into step beside her, and behind them his agents were securing the scene and bagging evidence and doing the procedural work of aftermath. And above them, the crane track gave one final metallic groan as the storm pushed through the structure. Nora walked through the north door and back into the rain. On Reyes's phone, the call was still connected. The woman on the other end was still there and had not spoken again, and Nora had not hung up. And in the silence between them was the name neither of them had said yet. The name of whoever inside the federal system had received the second alert and sent it upward through a chain that ended with Gaston. The name of the person who had helped bury the operation 4 years ago and was still in place, still functional, still protected by a review process that had been designed to miss exactly this. The name the drive would prove. The name Nora had carried in her memory for 4 years like a splinter she couldn't reach. She got into the vehicle. The door closed. Reyes started the engine, and in the hospital, 4 floors up, in a cardiothoracic ICU room with a single agent posted outside the door, Garrett Wills's monitors registered a change in his vital signs that the agent in the hallway had no medical training to interpret. The attending nurse who should have caught it was not on the floor. The alert sat on the monitoring station screen for 40 seconds before anyone noticed it. The drive was in a sealed evidence bag on the seat between them, and Nora did not look at it once during the 12-minute drive back to Harwick General. She was running the timeline instead, the 4-hour window the woman on the phone had described, the time already consumed by the pier operation, the variables she could control against the ones she couldn't. Reyes drove. He didn't ask her about what she'd said at the pier, about the things she'd put in place 3 years ago, the contingency she'd built into her existence at Harwick General, because she had never been naive enough to believe that quiet and invisible were the same as safe. He drove, and he let her think, which was something she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him. He knew when information would come, and when asking for it early just burned time. The hospital came into view through the rain. The perimeter vehicles were still there. 2 units, lights off, holding position at the entrance. The lockdown was still technically active. "The monitoring alert," she said as they pulled into the ambulance bay. "From Wills's room. I saw it on Farrow's relay." He cut the engine. "What are we looking at?" "Could be post-surgical arrhythmia. Could be something else." She was already opening the door. "Get someone you trust on that floor right now. Not hospital security. Yours." She was through the ambulance bay entrance before he finished his acknowledgement into the radio. The elevator was too slow. She took the stairs. The 4th-floor corridor felt different than it had 3 hours ago. The morning's controlled emergency had given way to something more complicated. Staff moving with the uncertain energy of people who'd been told something serious was happening, but not exactly what. The kind of institutional unease that spread through a hospital the way drafts spread through old buildings, invisibly, through every gap. The agent outside Wills's room was different from the one she'd seen that morning. Younger, alert, positioned correctly. Reyes had rotated personnel, which was good. She showed her badge, and he let her through. Wills was conscious. That was the first thing. She hadn't expected it, and the monitoring alert had prepared her for something worse. And the fact that he was awake and tracking her entry with eyes that were clearer than they had any right to be 6 hours post-intervention recalibrated her assessment immediately. His color was still bad. His pressure, on the monitor, was running lower than she wanted, but he was looking at her. "You're the one who didn't let me die," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation they'd managed during surgery. "Cardiothoracic kept you alive. I just got you to them." "That's not what they told me." He watched her check his monitor with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading people under pressure. "What's happening?" "You need to rest." "That's not an answer." She looked at him. He looked back. He had the same quality of stillness she'd noted when he came in. The kind that wasn't passivity, but control. Someone who'd learned to conserve energy for things that mattered. "The intelligence you were carrying has been recovered," she said. "The people who attacked you are in federal custody. You're safe in this room." "And outside this room?" She didn't answer that. "You're her," he said. "Aren't you? The one from the operation." She went still. "What operation?" "I wasn't just carrying a drive." He said it carefully, measuring each word against how much it cost him to produce it. "I was carrying a list. Personnel attached to the original mission, the ones whose records were altered in the after-action." He held her gaze. "I was told one of them was possibly alive, that if I found her I was supposed to tell her something." The monitoring equipment hummed. Outside the room, the corridor was quiet. "Tell her what?" Nora said. "That the Inspector General's office opened a formal investigation 14 days ago, that they have the communications logs from the original mission, the unredacted ones, not the Harlow summary, and that the investigation names Gaston." He paused to breathe. It cost him. "And one other person, someone who processed the after-action paperwork, someone inside the review structure who signed off on falsified casualty records." "Did they give you a name?" "They gave me a file reference. It's on the drive." He looked at the evidence bag that Reyes's agent had transferred to a secure lockbox in the corner of the room. The drive has two partitions. The first one is the intelligence everyone was looking for. The second one is the IG file. That's what they actually needed to suppress. She understood then why the confirmation team had come to the hospital, not just to verify she was alive, to verify whether she'd been in contact with Wills before the attack, whether she already knew what was on the second partition. She hadn't, but Gaston hadn't known that. That uncertainty was what had driven the timeline. That was the real engine of this morning. "Rest," she told Wills. "I mean it. You've got hardware in your chest and you're trying to hold a conversation." "Will you be here?" he asked. She thought about the 4-hour window, about the second alert that had gone to an unknown terminal, about the name on the IG file that was currently locked in the corner of this room. "Someone will be," she said. She found Reyes in the corridor and told him about the second partition in 30 seconds flat. She watched his face process it, the controlled recalibration she'd come to recognize as his response to information that changed the shape of a situation. "The IG investigation," he said. "If it's already open, then someone in Gaston's network knows it's open, and the file on that drive is either corroborating evidence or the thing that closes it definitively." She looked at him. "Pharaoh needs to image that drive immediately, both partitions, before anything else moves. The chain of custody." "Reyes." She kept her voice level. "Gaston received a second alert. Someone in a federal building with credentials is connected to his network and knows the primary operation at the dock failed. That person is either already moving to suppress the IG file through legitimate institutional channels, which they can do if they have the right position, or they're going to try something less institutional." She paused. "How long does a chain of custody process take versus how long it takes to make a phone call to the right person and have an investigation quietly reassigned?" He took out his phone. "I need Pharaoh in room 412, he said into it. "Now, with full imaging capability." He hung up and looked at her. "The woman who called, on my phone at the pier. Who was she?" "Someone who has been watching Gaston's network from a distance for a long time and couldn't move without the evidence on that drive." "That's not a name." "No," Nora agreed. "It isn't." He studied her for a moment. "Are you going to make this harder than it needs to be?" "I've spent 4 years making everything as simple and invisible as possible," she said. "And this morning, someone still found me. So I've reconsidered my general approach." She looked down the corridor toward the stairwell. "I need to get something. Give me 10 minutes. "Nora, 10 minutes. I'll be in the building." She met his eyes. "You have my word." He let her go. It was the second time he'd made that choice. She understood it was not a small thing for a federal agent to keep choosing, and she did not take it lightly. The thing she'd put in place 3 years ago was not dramatic. It was a 9 by 12 envelope in a sealed evidence bag, taped to the back of a loose ceiling panel in the fourth floor supply room. The same supply room alcove she'd stepped into that morning when she saw two men in wrong boots coming off an elevator. She had placed it there in the third week of her employment at Harwick General, and she had checked it exactly twice in 3 years, and both times it had been there. It contained three things: a USB drive with a personal record she'd compiled from memory, dates, locations, the specific content of the communication she'd intercepted during the blackout, as much technical detail as she could reconstruct from what she'd heard in 2 minutes on a backup channel 4 years ago. A signed statement, witnessed by a notary in Portland under a different name, describing what she had witnessed and attesting to its authenticity. And a photograph, the only copy she had, of a physical document she had seen briefly during the operations planning phase, a document that bore two signatures she recognized and a third she had identified later, in the long, careful months after she'd decided not to be dead anymore. The third signature was the name she'd been carrying for 4 years. She brought the envelope to Reyes. She set it on the conference room table without ceremony. He looked at it, then at her. "This is what you went to get," he said. "This is what I've been carrying since I faked my death and drove north and took a nursing job in a hospital where nobody knew my name." She pushed the envelope toward him. "It's a statement and supporting materials. Everything I witnessed. Everything I identified afterward." She paused. "The name on the document in there. I need you to verify it against the IG file on the drive before anything else happens. Because if it matches, then we don't have a peripheral network issue. We have someone currently embedded in the federal review structure who has been protecting Gaston for 4 years, and that person has credentials, and if they understand what's on that drive, they will use those credentials to bury it." Reyes opened the envelope. He read carefully. He was the kind of man who read carefully, not performing thoroughness, but actually doing it, absorbing rather than scanning. Nora stood at the window and watched the rain, which had begun to slacken slightly. The storm moving inland, the worst of it passing. She heard him stop turning pages. She turned from the window. His face had done something she hadn't seen it do all day. Not composure and not the controlled recalibration. Something older and less managed. "This name," he said. "Yes. This individual currently holds a position at the Defense Intelligence Oversight Committee." He said it the way people said things when they were working to make their voice behave. "They have direct supervisory access to ongoing IG investigations." "I know. If they have access to the investigation that Will's referenced, they can see everything: who's been interviewed, what evidence has been logged, what the investigative timeline looks like." She walked back to the table and sat down. "And if they saw the flag this morning, the biometric flag on the trauma bay footage, they understood immediately that the one witness who could place them in that original communication was alive and identifiable." Reyes set the pages down. "This is above my operational authority," he said. "I know that too. I need to contact you." "Carefully," she said. "Whatever contact you make needs to go around the oversight committee, not through it. If you use standard channels, and this person has any visibility into the routing, I understand." He was already thinking she could see it, running his own version of the same calculation she'd been running all morning. Who to call? Which channel was clean? How far up the chain the contamination went, and where the uncontaminated part began. "Mbeki," he said. "Mbeki reports to whom?" "Directly to the Deputy Director for Counterintelligence, separate command structure from the Oversight Committee." He looked at her. "She's clean." "Then use her." He picked up his radio. Dot. The next 40 minutes were the kind that didn't feel like 40 minutes. Nora sat in the conference room and drank bad coffee that someone had left in a carafe, and watched Reyes and Mbeki work the phones with the focused efficiency of people who understood that the window they were operating in was narrowing. Pharaoh imaged the drive, both partitions. The second partition contained exactly what Wills had described: IG file reference materials, communications logs, transaction records, and a name that matched exactly the third signature on the document in Nora's envelope: Deputy Oversight Director Sylvan Price, 17 years in federal service. Impeccable review record, the kind of institutional fixture that accumulated credibility through sheer duration. through the accumulated weight of being present and functional in every significant process for long enough that questioning him felt like questioning the furniture. He had co-signed a classified planning document for the operation 4 years ago. He had been copied on the communications channel that Nora had intercepted during the blackout, and his credentials had been used, not his username, his physical smart card credentials, to process the final version of the Harlow Review, the one that had buried the investigation and closed the case as an operational accident. And Becky laid it out for Reyes in the corridor while Nora listened through the open door. He processed the review, Becky said. Not just reviewed it. He was the certifying authority, which means if the review was falsified, he didn't just allow it, he executed it. Reyes's voice was flat, with the specific flatness of controlled anger. He signed off on the casualty list, including her. A pause. He declared a living person dead on classified record to close an investigation that would have exposed a contract he'd co-signed with a private mercenary network. The contract. The supplemental contract the woman on the phone had described. The one specifying that if primary evidence recovery failed, the witness had to be eliminated within 4 hours. Price had signed that contract too. He'd signed everything, because signing things was how he controlled them, and because for 4 years nothing had come close enough to threaten him. Until this morning. Nora set down the coffee, and Becky appeared in the doorway. She looked at Nora with an expression that had been recalibrating all day, and had arrived finally, somewhere that looked like reckoning. "We have authorization from the deputy director," she said. "Federal warrant for Price's credentials and communications. A second team is moving on his office in the next 30 minutes. She paused. "We also have confirmation that Gaston's passport flagged at Portland International 45 minutes ago. He didn't make the flight. He's still in Oregon." Nora stood up. "Where?" "Unknown. But his financial activity in the last 2 hours," Becky looked at her tablet, "includes a cash withdrawal at a branch in Millhaven, which is 22 kilometers north of Draylen." Millhaven. North along the coast road, past the freight depot, past the section of highway where the guardrail had been replaced twice in 5 years because of weather damage, and where the road narrowed to 1 lane at the bridge crossing. She'd driven it so many times she could map it with her eyes closed. "He's not running north," she said. "Why not?" "Because north connects to the coast highway, which connects to the ferry terminal at Crestfall Bay, and the ferry schedule." She stopped, thought about it. "What time is the next departure?" And Becky looked it up. Her expression shifted. 2 hours and 15 minutes from now. He withdrew cash to buy a walk-on ticket. No vehicle, no reservation, no digital footprint. Nora looked at Reyes, who had come back into the room. "He's going to walk onto a ferry as a civilian passenger and be across the strait before anyone thinks to check the terminal." "We can call the terminal." "You can. But Gaston will have a fallback identity. He's been running operations for 15 years. He has contingency documentation and he knows how to use it. You need people physically at that terminal before he arrives." She paused. "How long to get someone there?" "Fast response from Millhaven substation. 40 minutes. Then you have a window, small one." She looked at both of them. "What do you need from me?" Reyes looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the envelope on the table, her 3 years of careful documentation, her 4 years of carrying a secret she'd been willing to die with, the thing she'd built as insurance and never thought she'd actually have to use. "Your formal statement," he said. "On record. Everything you witnessed, everything you compiled." He picked up the envelope. "This is the foundation of the case. We need it on record today, before any of Price's institutional access can be used to challenge the evidentiary chain." "Then let's do it," she said. She sat back down at the table, and for the next 90 minutes, she talked. She'd never told it to anyone in sequence before. In 4 years, the things she'd carried had existed as separate fragments. The communication she'd intercepted, the signature she'd recognized, the slow reconstruction she'd assembled in the quiet mornings, and the insomniac hours that populated her first year in Draylen. Telling it in order from the beginning, with a federal recorder running and Mbeki taking notes and Reyes listening without expression, made it feel different than she'd expected. Not lighter, exactly. More real, more fixed. like something that had existed only in her own memory was being transferred to a medium that didn't depend on her to survive. She was thorough. She was accurate. She corrected herself twice when she reached the limits of what she knew versus what she'd inferred. And she labeled those distinctions clearly because the difference between what she'd witnessed and what she'd concluded mattered, and a defense attorney would find every unguarded conflation if she left any. When she finished, the recorder had been running for 87 minutes. And Becky stopped it without comment. She looked at her notes. She looked at Reyes. He looked at Nora. "The deputy director's office has been notified," he said. "Price's credentials have been suspended as of 40 minutes ago. His communications are being intercepted under the warrant." He paused. "2 of his staff have already been removed from the Oversight Committee building for questioning. And Gaston?" 3 agents at the Crestfall Bay Ferry Terminal arrived 12 minutes ago." His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something in his expression changed. A flicker, quickly managed. "They have him." She'd known it was coming. She'd said the window was small, but she'd believed it was real. The knowing and the hearing were still different things. She exhaled slowly through her nose. "He had a secondary passport," Reyes said. "Croatian issuance, good quality. He made it to the terminal, and he almost made it to the boarding line." He set his phone down. One of the agents recognized his gait from the surveillance footage at the pier. He'd changed his appearance. Hair, glasses, different jacket, but the way he walked was the same. A pause. "He's in custody." The conference room was quiet. Outside the window, the rain had stopped. The sky over Dryland was the particular shade of gray that preceded clearing. Not bright yet, but no longer actively hostile. The storm had moved through. Nora sat with the silence for a moment. She thought about what she'd expected to feel. In the years when she'd allowed herself to think about this, usually at 2 or 3 in the morning, when the ER was quiet and the coast road was empty and the dark pressed in from the Pacific with a weight she'd never entirely gotten used to, she'd imagined something definitive, some internal shift, some closing. What she actually felt was tired and cautious, because Gaston in custody and Price's credentials suspended were the beginning of a legal process, not the end of one. Federal cases took time. Defense attorneys were capable people. Evidence chains could be challenged. "What's the status of the IG investigation?" she asked. "Reconstituted under direct deputy director oversight, bypassing the committee entirely." Mbeki answered this one. "The investigation lead has been briefed on Price's involvement. They're treating the last 4 years of committee involvement as potentially compromised and going back to raw documentation." She paused. "Your statement and the drive are being logged as primary evidence." "Timeline to indictment?" "Realistically, several months. This is complex. Multiple jurisdictions, classified components, the contractor network Gaston was running." Mbeki looked at her steadily. "But the case is solid. What you built," she gestured at the envelope, "in combination with the drive and Wills's testimony, creates a record that's going to be very difficult to dismantle." Nora nodded. "Dr. Gall is looking for you," Reyes said. She blinked. "What?" "The lead trauma surgeon. He's been asking the nursing staff where you are for the last 2 hours." He said it neutrally, but there was something in his delivery that suggested he found this mildly interesting. "I got a message from Dale Ostrander, the charge nurse supervisor, that Gall specifically requested that someone locate the nurse from Bay 3. She thought about Gall, about the way he'd said stay out of the diagnostic with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been wrong about who in his department was worth listening to, about the way he'd looked at the ultrasound screen for a long moment after she'd shown him the effusion. "What does he want?" she asked. "He didn't say." A pause. "He said it twice, apparently. It might be official. Questions about the intervention, liability concerns, protocol review." Another pause. "Or it might be something else." She stood up. Her back hurt from the concrete floor at the pier. Her jaw had a bruise developing along the left side that she'd looked at briefly in a bathroom mirror and categorized as non-structural. She was still in scrubs that had been through a storm and a waterfront operation, and were showing all of it. "I'll go find him," she said. She was at the door when Reyes said her name. She turned. He had the envelope in his hands. He held it out toward her, not returning it, but the gesture meant something, an acknowledgement. "What you built here," he said. "Not today, over 4 years." He looked at the envelope. The preparation, the documentation, the contingency. Most people in your situation, they run. They keep running. He looked at her. "You stayed." "I stayed because Draylen has a level 2 trauma center and an ER that needed nurses," she said. "That's part of it." She looked at him. He wasn't wrong that it was only part of it. The other part was harder to say, was the kind of thing that lived in the pre-dawn stillness of a hospital corridor at the end of a long shift, in the particular satisfaction of a patient who made it through, and in the particular grief of one who didn't, in the accumulated weight of 3 years of showing up to a job that saw her as ordinary and finding that being ordinary was not the worst thing she'd ever been. "I'll be in the ER," she said, and walked out. Gall was standing at the nursing station on the main floor when she came through. He was a big man, and he occupied space the way big men did, but when he saw her come through the bay doors, he did something she'd never seen him do in 3 years. He waited. She crossed the floor toward him. He was looking at her with the expression of someone who had been thinking about what to say for long enough that the thinking had outlasted the right words. "Dr. Gall?" "Ms. Voss." He used her name. It was the first time. She noted it without showing that she noted it. "I wanted to—" He stopped, started differently. "The patient from this morning, I reviewed the imaging from before and after your intervention. Is he stable?" "He's doing well, better than he should be, given the timeline." He held her gaze. "I pulled your employment file." She waited. "Your certifications? Your listed training?" He said it evenly, not accusatory, more like someone working through something that didn't add up and needed to say so aloud. "None of it accounts for what I watched you do in Bay 3. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." "I don't know what accounts for it," he said. "And I understand that's—" He gestured vaguely. "Not something you're going to explain to me in the nursing station." "Probably not." "Okay." He straightened slightly. "Then what I came to say is this. I've been running trauma at this hospital for 11 years, and I've worked with a lot of nurses. Good ones. Some excellent ones." He looked at her directly. "I have never watched someone read a pericardial effusion off a point-of-care ultrasound in an active trauma situation and then perform a clean pericardiocentesis without any deviation in a patient who had maybe 90 seconds. He paused. "I told the department head as much in those words this afternoon." She looked at him. "I also told him that the protocol review of your intervention, the question of whether it was within scope, should take into account that the patient is alive," he said, "and that I will make that argument to the board if it becomes necessary." The nursing station was not a private place. Doreen, who had been in the department for 11 years, was charting 3 feet away and was absolutely not appearing to listen. "I appreciate that," Nora said, and meant it. "Right." He cleared his throat. He had apparently used up what he'd come to say. "There's a patient in Bay 2 with a suspected femur fracture who's been waiting 40 minutes and the attending is stuck in a procedure." He looked at her sideways. "If you're not—" "I'll take a look," she said. She moved toward Bay 2. Behind her, she heard Doreen say very quietly, to no one in particular, 40 minutes we've been waiting for somebody to check on him." She was midway through the femur assessment when Mbeki appeared in the bay doorway. Her expression was controlled in the specific way that meant something had happened that required controlled expression. Nora finished the secondary assessment, probable mid-shaft fracture, good distal pulses, no compartment syndrome developing, ortho consult needed, and asked the patient if he was comfortable with the current pain management before she stepped out. "What?" she said to Mbeki. "Price," Mbeki said. "His team is saying he has documents, records from the original operation that he claims establish he was operating under authorized instruction, that the decision to close the investigation was directed from a level above his." She paused. "He's saying he has a chain of command memo authorizing the falsification of the casualty records." Nora felt something sharpen in her chest. From whom? "That's the problem. He's refusing to name the source until he has a formal immunity agreement on paper. Mbeki looked at her steadily. If the memo is real, it means the order didn't originate with Price. It means someone above him, someone with authority over the entire review structure, directed this from the top. And if it's fabricated, he's trying to buy time with a document he manufactured in the last 6 hours. Yes. Can you verify the document's authenticity? We're working on it. Forensic document team is en route to his office. It'll take hours. Mbeki paused. But, in the meantime, his attorney has filed an emergency motion to delay the suspension of his credentials, citing ongoing operational necessity. The judge is reviewing it now, which meant there was a window, a narrow, specific window, in which Price's institutional access might be temporarily restored before the document's authenticity was confirmed or denied, in which someone with credentials and motive could reach into an ongoing IG investigation and move evidence. The drive, Nora said. Where is it right now? Federal evidence lockup at the Draylen field office. Is the field office's evidence management system networked to the Oversight Committee's database? Mbeki went very still. For cross-referencing classified evidence tags, Nora said, standard procedure for cases involving classified operations. The Oversight Committee has read access. Mbeki was already on her phone. Nora stood in the corridor of the ER and thought about what Price was doing. Not panicking, not improvising, but running a contingency. He'd had 4 years and an institutional position to prepare contingencies. The memo he was claiming to possess might be fabricated, or it might be real and pointing somewhere that hadn't occurred to anyone yet. Either way, the delay it was buying him was the point. Her phone, Reyes had given her one of the spare agency handsets before she'd come downstairs, buzzed. She answered it. The motion was denied, Reyes said. Credentials stay suspended. The judge was unpersuaded. She exhaled. But Price named someone, Reyes continued, in the room before the ruling came through. He named the source of the authorization memo. A pause, and in that pause she heard something that made her stay very still. The name he gave is someone who died 8 years ago, a former senior official whose records are classified. His voice was careful. A name that is impossible to verify and impossible to disprove quickly. She understood immediately. He's buying a different kind of time. Yes, a contested attribution that requires significant investigative resources to resolve, during which the primary evidence chain becomes subject to challenge because the authorization question is unresolved. A longer pause. It's smart. It's exactly what someone with 15 years of institutional navigation would do when their primary options are closed. What does your deputy director say? That the investigation continues regardless. That Price's attribution claim is noted and will be investigated in parallel. His voice shifted slightly. But Nora, the memo he's referencing, he provided a document number, a classified file reference. Another pause, the kind with weight in it. The document number matches a real file. She gripped the phone. That file, Reyes said, is in a classified archive, sealed. Has been for 8 years. He said the next part slowly. It was sealed by the same oversight committee that Price chaired until this morning. She stood in the corridor of Harwick General, in the scrubs she'd been wearing since 6 a.m., and understood what she was hearing. Price hadn't just sealed his own exposure. He'd sealed the document that would either prove or disprove his claim. The document that might exonerate him completely or bury him deeper, and either way, accessing it required committee authority that he currently didn't have. But someone did. The committee, she said. Who has active authority now that Price is suspended? A pause. The acting chair, Reyes said, was designated automatically upon Price's suspension. Per committee charter, the role defaults to the most senior active member. He said the name carefully. And it was a name she recognized. Not from the operation, not from the documents or the communications or the 4 years of careful reconstruction. From 3 months into her time at Harwick General, from a newspaper left in the break room, from a photograph and a story about federal committee restructuring that she'd looked at for 5 seconds and filed away because she filed everything away. A name she had never connected to Gaston, to Price, to any of it, until right now, in a hospital corridor, when it clicked into place with the particular finality of something that had always been true and had simply waited for the right angle of light. "Reyes," she said. "I know," he said. "Does Mbeki know?" "I'm telling her now." "The sealed file," she said. "The acting chair has authority to access it." "Yes." "Then you have about 30 minutes before they do." 30 minutes was generous. Reyes knew it and Nora knew it, and neither of them wasted any of it saying so. She heard him on the phone as she moved back toward the stairwell. Not running, walking fast, the way you moved when you needed to cover distance without broadcasting urgency to everyone you passed. The ER behind her was doing what ERs did, cycling through its own perpetual motion, patients and staff, and the particular controlled noise of a department that never fully stopped. She was on the second-floor landing when Reyes came through the door above her. "Mbeki's already with the deputy director," he said, catching up. "They're moving to freeze the acting chair's committee access. Federal override. It bypasses the standard authorization chain." "How long?" 15 minutes if it goes clean. "And if it doesn't?" "Then we have a problem." He was beside her now, both of them moving down the stairwell. "The acting chair is Senator Halford Crane. He's been on the Oversight Committee for 9 years. Before that, 12 years on the Senate Armed Services Committee." He said it with the flat precision of someone delivering information that tasted bad. "He has more institutional relationships in the federal intelligence structure than anyone currently trying to freeze his access." The name Crane had not appeared in any document she'd built over 4 years. She understood now why it hadn't, because Crane had never signed anything, had never put his name on a direct authorization, had operated through Price the way experienced political actors operated through subordinates, creating a layer of insulation that looked like normal committee oversight right up until it didn't. Price naming him was either the most desperate thing a cornered man could do, or it was the most calculated. She wasn't sure which, and the difference mattered. "Is Price's memo real?" she asked. "Forensics says the document paper stock is consistent with the period it claims. The printing format matches. The classification stamps are accurate." Reyes paused on the first-floor landing. "It's either genuine or someone with very detailed access to historical document standards fabricated it. Neither option is simple." "If it's genuine, then Crane directed the falsification." "Yes. And if Crane directed it, then the network wasn't Gaston's operation with Price as the institutional cover. It was Crane's operation with both of them as layers." She looked at Reyes. Gaston ran the field side. Price managed the review structure. Crane sat above both of them, and nobody was supposed to reach him. Until Price decided that going down alone was worse than taking everyone with him. She thought about that for a moment. About the particular calculus of a man like Price, careful, institutional, accustomed to controlling outcomes, making the decision in a federal holding room that his only remaining leverage was a name he'd protected for 4 years. It wasn't loyalty breaking down. It was arithmetic. "He'll negotiate," she said. "He'll trade Crane for a reduced charge. His attorneys are already drafting." "Almost certainly." "Then you don't need the sealed file to prove the connection. Price is going to prove it for you." Reyes looked at her. Something in his expression settled. That's what the deputy director concluded about 12 minutes ago. She absorbed that. So the freeze on Crane's access buys time for Price to formalize his cooperation agreement, which removes Crane's opportunity to use the committee position to interfere with the evidence chain before Price's testimony puts him inside the network. He looked at her steadily. "It worked. Mbeki got the override through 8 minutes ago." She stood in the stairwell of Harwick General and let the last 24 hours catch up with her for about 4 seconds. Then she put it back where it belonged. "Crane," she said. "What happens to him?" "He was escorted from his Senate office building at..." Reyes checked his phone. 41 minutes ago. 2 federal agents, no press, very quiet. He'll be questioned through the night." He paused. "It won't stay quiet. These things don't." No, they didn't. A sitting senator, a federal oversight director, a retired special operations officer running a mercenary network. The legal process would take months. The public dimension would take longer, and nothing about it would be clean or fast or satisfying in the immediate way that movies made it look. That was the reality of institutional accountability. It was slow and procedural and often deeply unsatisfying to watch. But it was real. It was happening. And the evidence that made it happen was sitting in a federal evidence lockup with her signature on the chain of custody documentation. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Right now?" "Nothing." He held her gaze. "You've been awake for how long?" "That's not relevant." "Nora." She looked at him. He was doing it again, using her name with that particular directness that wasn't aggressive and wasn't soft, and that she had been quietly recalibrating her assessment of all day. "There will be more formal interviews," he said. "Testimony preparation. The IG investigation will want you on record multiple times. Your statement from this afternoon is the foundation, but it's not the end." He paused. "But tonight, none of that is happening. Tonight, what happens is that Gaston is in a federal holding facility, Price is negotiating his cooperation, Crane is being questioned, and the drive and your documentation are in evidence." He let that land. "You can stop moving for a few hours." She thought about when she had last stopped moving. "There's a patient in Bay 2 with a femur fracture who needs an ortho consult," she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Go be a nurse," he said. "I'll be here." She pushed through the stairwell door and went back to the ER. No. The ortho consult for the femur fracture took 40 minutes and went fine. She worked 3 more patients after that. A pediatric asthma case that responded to treatment quickly, a laceration on a construction worker's forearm that needed irrigation and closure, an elderly woman with chest pain that turned out to be musculoskeletal and not cardiac, which Nora assessed correctly before the attending arrived, and which the attending confirmed without comment. The department moved around her the way it always did. Monitors and voices and the rolling percussion of gurney wheels on linoleum. She moved through it with the same practiced efficiency she'd brought to every shift for 3 years, and nobody looked at her differently. Nobody on the floor knew yet what had happened in the conference room upstairs, what she'd said into a federal recorder for 87 minutes, what was currently working its way through the institutional machinery of federal law enforcement. Doreen knew something. She'd been in the department long enough to know when a day was different from other days without being told why. She handed Nora a chart once without speaking and touched her elbow briefly in a way that communicated more than a sentence would have, and Nora accepted it the way it was offered. At 8:40 in the evening, Dale Ostrander found her at the nursing station. He looked like he'd had a harder day than usual, which was saying something. He set both hands on the counter and looked at her with the expression of someone who had received information through multiple channels over the course of several hours and was still working out what to do with it. "I've been asked to let you know," he said carefully, "that your employment status is not under review." She looked at him. The department head spoke with legal. "The intervention in Bay 3 is being classified as an exceptional circumstance response, given the outcome and given," he paused, "given other contexts that came to light today." He cleared his throat. "You're not in trouble." "Okay," she said. He stood there for a moment. She understood he was trying to say something that didn't have a clean form. "Dale," she said. "Yeah." "It's fine. I know you didn't know." He nodded. He picked up the chart he'd come to return and then put it down again. "For what it's worth," he said, "the work orders. The door. I should have followed up." She hadn't expected that. It landed differently than she'd have predicted. Not as vindication exactly, but as something smaller and more human. An acknowledgement from a man who hadn't thought she was worth listening to, offered without anyone requiring him to. "Maintenance fixed it this afternoon," she said. "I checked." He almost smiled. Then he picked up the chart and walked away. Garrett Wills was moved to a standard monitored room on the 3rd floor at 9:15, the ICU level of care no longer required, his vitals stable enough that the cardiothoracic team had signed off on the step-down. Nora heard about it from the 3rd floor charge nurse who called down about medication reconciliation, and she completed the documentation and then, at the end of her shift, took the elevator up. He was awake. The room was dim, the overhead off, just the monitoring equipment providing its faint green glow. He looked better than he had that morning, still rough, still carrying the particular pallor of someone who'd lost meaningful blood volume and was rebuilding, but present, tracking. He looked at her when she came in, and he didn't look surprised to see her. "They told me your name," he said. "Which one?" "Both." He held her gaze. "They told me what you did, here and at the dock." A pause. "And what you've been doing for 4 years." She sat in the chair beside his bed. "How much did they tell you?" "Enough." His voice was still rough. "I've been in enough operations to understand what it costs to do what you did, to walk away from everything you were, build a cover, stay put, keep documentation." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Most people don't do that. Most people run and keep running." "I thought about it." "What stopped you?" She considered the question. It wasn't one she'd answered aloud before, not completely. In the long months of the first year, when she'd been building the nursing job and the paper trail and the envelope in the ceiling, she had not articulated to herself why she was staying. She told herself it was tactical, that staying put and building evidence was smarter than running. That was true as far as it went, but it wasn't the whole answer. "This hospital needed nurses," she said, "and I was good at it." She looked at him. "Not the cover, the actual work. I was good at it, and it needed doing, and staying in one place long enough to do it well felt like, I don't know, like something I hadn't had in a long time." "A reason," he said. "Something like that." He was quiet for a moment. The monitor tracked his heart rate, steady, recovering. "Calloway sends his regards," Will said. "He wanted me to tell you that the 2 hours he promised you, he knows it was closer to 5. She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter than a laugh, but in the same family. "Tell him we're even on the protein bar." Wills looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "He said you'd know what that meant." "I do." She stood up. He needed rest, and she needed to finish her shift documentation, and there was nothing more to say tonight that wouldn't keep until morning. "Thank you," he said as she reached the door. "For this morning." She stopped. She thought about what to say. She thought about the monitors screaming and the 90 seconds she'd assessed, and the moment she'd said, "Move to a room full of people who had every institutional reason not to listen to her." "You would have done the same," she said. "Maybe." He settled back against the pillow. "But you did it." Damon Reyes was waiting in the lobby when she came down at 11:15, her shift officially over, her badge still on, her scrubs having accumulated the evidence of a day that had started with a trauma bay and ended with something she still didn't have a clean word for. He stood up when he saw her. "Crane's attorney has been in contact with the deputy director's office," he said without preamble. "He's not cooperating yet, but Price's cooperation agreement was signed 2 hours ago." He paused. "In exchange for his testimony against Crane and his full disclosure of the contractor network Gaston ran, he's looking at reduced charges and reduced sentencing. He gave us 11 names tonight, 11 people embedded across federal contractor and oversight structures who were part of the network." He held her gaze. "Some of them have already been suspended. 2 are being detained. The rest will be by morning." 11 names. 4 years of a network built carefully enough that it had survived a formal review process, had declared people dead and buried investigations, and moved intelligence for profit, had sent teams to hospitals and ferry terminals and waterfront docks. And tonight it was coming apart from the inside because one of its architects had done the arithmetic and decided the numbers worked better with his cooperation than without it. "And Gaston?" she asked. "He's not cooperating. He knows what cooperation means for him, given the extent of what they're going to find. He's lawyering up for a long fight." Reyes looked at her steadily. "It won't matter. The drive, your documentation, Price's testimony, the communications logs the IG already had. There are 4 independent evidentiary threads pointing at the same network. His attorney is going to earn their fee, and it's not going to change the outcome." She believed him. Not because she was optimistic, she wasn't particularly, but because she had built one of those threads herself, carefully, over 4 years, and she knew its quality. "What happens to me?" she asked. He reached into his jacket and took out an envelope. Not the envelope. Her envelope was in evidence. A different one, official, with a federal seal on the flap. "Your identity documentation," he said. Nora Voss is a federal cover identity that was maintained without institutional authorization for 4 years, which creates some paperwork issues. He handed her the envelope. Inside there is a letter from the deputy director acknowledging that your actions were taken under circumstances that justified the unauthorized cover, and directing that all records associated with your civilian identity at Harwick General be maintained as legitimate documentation. He paused. You're not in legal jeopardy. Your employment is intact. Your nursing license is intact. Another pause. Your actual identity, your service record, your classified personnel file. The IG investigation will determine how it's formally addressed once the case is resolved. But for the purposes of this hospital, this city, and the life you built here, you're Nora Voss. That's not going away. She looked at the envelope. She thought about what it meant to have built something real inside a fiction, and to have the fiction eventually hold the weight of the real thing. She thought about 3 years of double shifts and work orders, and patients she remembered, and a door that stuck for too long before anyone fixed it. There's one more thing, Reyes said. She looked up. The Inspector General's formal recommendation. It's going to include a commendation for your actions today and for the documentation you maintained. He said it without fanfare. It's classified, which means nobody outside a specific circle will read it, but it will exist, on record, attributed to your actual name. He held her gaze, the one that was on the casualty list. She'd spent 4 years being officially dead. The idea of a commendation with her real name on it, filed in the same institutional system that had declared her deceased, had a circularity to it that she couldn't quite make herself feel one way about. Okay, she said. That's it? Okay? What do you want me to say? He almost smiled. It looked like it cost him something, the way genuine expressions cost people who'd learned to manage their faces professionally. I don't know, something more. I'm tired, she said, and I have a shift in 9 hours. He looked at her for a moment, a longer look than was strictly informational, the kind that had been accumulating all day in the margins of the operational ones. Then he nodded. Go home, he said. She walked to the door. The automatic door, fixed now, sliding open at the first approach instead of stuttering, led her through into the night. The storm had moved completely inland. The air outside Harwick General was cold and washed clean, the kind of air that only existed after a long rain, when everything that had been sitting in the atmosphere for days had been pushed through and out and replaced. The parking lot was wet and reflective, the overhead lights throwing long duplicates of themselves across the standing water. She stood outside for a moment. She thought about what Gall had said to her at the nursing station, about the board meeting he'd committed to attending on her behalf if it became necessary. She thought about Dale Ostrander and the door and the small, imperfect weight of an apology that didn't fix anything but wasn't nothing. She thought about Doreen's hand on her elbow and Wills's voice saying you did it, and Calloway on a phone line saying Christ in a voice that carried 4 years of guilt and relief in 2 letters. She thought about what it had cost her, because it had cost her things she would not get back. 4 years of being someone else, 4 years of compression and concealment, 4 years of lying in small and large ways to people she had come to genuinely care about. That cost was real, and she was not going to dress it up. But she had stayed. She had built something here that was hers, not her covers, not the fictions, hers. And it had been worth building, and it had held, and tonight, somewhere in a federal evidence lockup, a drive sat inside a sealed bag with her signature on the chain of custody. And the people who had built a career on the assumption that she was either dead or running had discovered, at significant personal expense, that she was neither. She pulled her jacket tighter against the cold. There was a kind of person who became invisible because the world decided they weren't worth seeing, who was overlooked not because they lacked ability or worth, but because they operated below the threshold of what the people with authority had decided to pay attention to. She had been that person before the operation, in a different way, in the lower ranks of a military structure that valued her skills without valuing her judgment. She had been that person at Harwick General, in the particular institutional hierarchy of a hospital where nurses were functional and doctors were significant, and the difference between the two was reinforced by 100 small daily frictions. Being invisible had nearly killed her. It had also saved her life. She had learned to use both. But she was done being invisible now. Not because she'd been recognized. Recognition was its own complicated thing, and she didn't trust it yet. Didn't know what it would feel like when the classified commendation was filed, and Gaston went to trial, and Crane's attorneys filed their first motion, and the whole long, grinding process of accountability began to move. She was done being invisible because she had used what she knew, in the moment it was needed, without waiting for permission. She had said, move to a room full of people who outranked her, and she had been right, and the patient was alive, and the rest of it had followed from there. That was the thing nobody told you about strength that had been kept quiet for a long time. It didn't disappear when it was hidden. It accumulated. She walked to her car. In 9 hours, she would be back in the ER. There would be patients who needed assessment and medication reconciliation, and someone to notice the things that the monitors didn't capture and the attendings didn't have time to look for. There would be a door that now opened correctly and a charge supervisor who would probably flinch slightly every time he saw her for the next 2 months, and a surgeon who had made a commitment to a board meeting that he might or might not have to keep. There would be work, real work, the kind that mattered in a different register than federal investigations and evidence chains, the kind that mattered to individual people in individual moments of crisis, which was the kind she had chosen when she drove north and took a nursing job and decided that being ordinary was something she could build a life inside. She drove home through the clean, cold air of an Oregon coast night, the road empty, the water on either side dark and calm after the storm, the lights of Draylen small and warm behind her. She was still Nora Voss. She was also still the person she'd been before that, the one with the service record and the classified commendation and the 4 years of careful documentation and the hands that didn't shake in a trauma bay. Both of those things were true. Neither of them canceled the other out. She had learned, finally, that she didn't have to choose. The road ahead was dark and long and hers, and she drove it without looking back.